this dependency ratio will increase. It's lower for the high immigration scenario, but irrespective, it will go up. And the implication is that even if you forget about any economic growth, just to support the young and the old would require us to basically work 20 to 30% harder or longer. So if you're working 10-hour days and you're not any more productive, you might have to work 12 or 13-hour days in the future. And that's scary. Another issue with population, as Mark hinted, is energy use. And here's, again, historical and look and some scenarios about our use of oil in Australia. And we see our use of it has increased over the years, but we then started producing oil, so we weren't having to import a lot. The three scenarios show that our use is going up, or likely to go up, and these are very conservative, actually, scenarios. There's not a lot of economic growth built into these. So you can see the high population scenario has the highest oil use. The issue is Australia, like the rest of the world, is undergoing peak oil issue, where our production is flattening out and likely to decrease in the future. So there's a huge wedge of oil that we would have to import or find some other fuels to power our transport fleets. And there's a whole other story all based around some of those possibilities. So if you think that the price of petrol is high now, then we're going to be even more susceptible to that in future years, assuming that that oil is there in the global scene. And a lot of this comes about because energy is so fundamental to economies. So the lower graph shows GDP from 1900 up to the turn of the century, and also the primary energy consumption. I'm not going to point out either graph because there's little point. They're basically very closely tied. Well, obviously that burning, combustion of oil in transport and combustion of coal for electricity and other things clearly leads to CO2 emissions. So here again is our historical trend in those CO2 emissions. So this data doesn't include things like land use change or the effects of cow farting or fertiliser and those sort of things. It's just pure CO2 from combustion. And you see that in that respect we're well above our 1990 emissions and likely to grow again. Again, a high population scenario has the highest CO2 emissions. Is it possible that technology would help us out in this? Well, some sub-scenarios show that it does help, but not a great deal. And there's some caveats I have to put on this as well. So here again are the same lines as in the upper graph, but here's where we switch to power stations going to their thermodynamic limits in efficiency. The whole car fleet of Australia switching over to hybrids, and buildings becoming twice as efficient in their energy use. And the effect is that the CO2 emissions do indeed plateau out for a while, but the rest of the assumptions about the economy mean that it starts to grow again. The caveat on this is that we haven't included any rebound effect in here. If you're being more efficient, someone is saving money, and that money gets reinvested in the economy somewhere. So these are rather conservative graphs in a way. Another implication, which I touched on before, was that our oil situation would impact on our trade situation. And here you can see historically a trade deficit, and we see some rather optimistic assumptions about prices that were built into these graphs, showing our trade deficit going positive, largely because barter banks were bending over backwards to be conservative and try and fit in with the paradigm of economic growth. not set off too many alarm bells. And those growing curves are associated with exporting coal, by and large. But the point to note is that the trade balance is actually better for the lower population scenario. And why is that? I won't go into the detail of this graph, but basically sum it up by saying that the smaller population uses less resources and therefore could export more, gaining more dollars, but it requires less white goods and cars and so on, so it doesn't have to import as much and therefore doesn't have to pay so much. So the trade balance is better, everything else being equal for a smaller population. And of course, part of trade is the agricultural scene, here we're between a rock and a hard place. For example, as we've increased the area in agriculture, we've basically masked the ageing effect of the land. So that if we were to hold the land area constant into the future, the degradation associated with the continual use of that land would eventually catch up and reduce the productivity of that land. So is there an alternative of doing what we've done in the past and exponentially increasing agricultural land use? Well, if you were to continue that historical trend, we would double the area under crops and grazing in just a matter of a few decades. And before the century's out, we would theoretically occupy half the land as Australia. And I think you saw some of the images that Mark showed of the areas that are really fertile in Australia, so that's just not possible. There are other scenarios that are worth looking at. They would perhaps entail reducing Australia's agricultural land